Now it's been a good couple of days since Gage, the Mechromancer, was introduced into Borderlands 2. Now everyone's been using the class, myself included, and what this video is here to do today is to give you my first impressions not just on the class itself, but also on the skill trees available. Now the reason I'm doing this is not simply because of the fact that I need new content every Friday. No, it does fill the gap, don't get me wrong, but that's not the reason. The reason I'm doing it is simply because a lot of stuff in the skill trees does need clarifying a little bit, especially those concerning the ordered chaos side. As a result, instead of going through every little statistic, every little detail, what I'm going to do instead is focus more on those skills that really reflect the mentality of the skill tree. So whether it be aggressive or defensive, I'll pick out the traits that really illustrate that point. But first things first, let's talk about the basics here. Let's talk about what you're getting into when you pick Gage as your character to walk onto the plains of Pandora with. Now, Gage being level 1, she starts off with some of the lowest health around out of all the classes in my opinion, and that sort of continues on as you progress through the levels. So that means in the very early stages, unless you're very careful or have quite a high capacity shield, you're going to get smacked around a bit. But never fear, Vault Hunter, because once you reach level 5, you're going to unlock your ability, which of course is Death Trap. Now, Death Trap is primarily a massive melee robot. It can charge in there, swipe at ground-based enemies, and take them out for you. You can just sit back, put up a deck chair, sip on a pina colada, job's a good un. In addition to this, he can also take down air-based enemies as well. So when the dreaded rack attack comes in, he can sit there, fire off electric bolts, take them out for you. So again, you're safe from air-based enemies too. Without any enhancements from any of the skill trees, Death Trap's duration seems to be pretty long. In fact, I'd go as far to say, out of all 5 skills available, his is the longest. But in saying that, it does come with a pretty hefty cooldown, 60 seconds. And again, like I said, with Gage having some of the lowest health available out of all the characters, you really need to be careful when and where you deploy Death Trap, or else you're going to be left short in those situations where you could really do with some backup. The other thing to mention about Death Trap as well is not only has he got a long cooldown, he's also not indestructible. He can be taken out by enemies. So ignore my reckless advice earlier about kicking back, getting a drink. You actually need to take out some of those enemies as well to preserve both of your lives, if anything. But if you are in your fight for your life phase, don't worry, because if Death Trap does get a kill, that counts as a revive, so you come back ready to fight another battle. With that being said, that's not taking into account any contributions made by the skill trees, because there wouldn't be any. You're only just turned level 5. You still find bullymongs challenging. But anyway, we're going to start looking at bolstering up your stats and your defences, but before we do, I realise this is going to be a pretty long video, so what I'm going to do is put little fast travel links along the top of the video, so you can click on those and it'll take you to the relevant skill tree you want to check out. Go ahead, choose. I'll put on some elevator music while you're deciding. Now the far left skill tree is primarily focused on your health, your defense, and later on in the skill tree extending the duration that Death Trap remains active. So if you're looking at health and defense, you've got abilities such as cooking up trouble, which means if your magazine's full, health regen's going off at the same time. You've also got fancy mathematics as well, which means basically the less amount of health you've got means the less time you've got to wait for your shield to start recharging, but also it increases the rate your shield recharges at. But it's not all me, because as the skill tree name implies, there is an element of partnership, you two working in tandem, and there's a lot of abilities that improve both your stats. For instance, Potent as a Pony, which increases the max health of both you and Death Trap. Moreover, there's also Made of Sterner Stuff, which equals a damage reduction for both you and Death Trap, and also Death Trap gains a melee damage increase as well. In a similar vein, there's also Upshot Robot, which means for each kill Death Trap gets, it extends the duration he remains active, but in addition to that, each kill gives both of you stackable bonus melee damage as well. To further improve the duration which Death Trap remains active on the battlefield, there's also Sharing is Caring, which basically gives him a copy of the shield you currently have equipped, and in those situations to help combat the cooldown of the ability, there's also 20% Cooler, which at its highest level reduces the cooldown by 30%. The middle skill tree has a big focus on elemental attacks and inflicting them. Not only that, but also increasing the damage that is dealt and also creating additional effects. Even though the skill tree itself seems primarily focused on electrocution and shock weapons, that's not to say it ignores every other type of status effect, because the first ability, More Pep, actually increases the chance of inflicting all status effects. However, like I said before, there is a big focus on electrocution damage, which is reflected in some of the abilities, such as Shockstorm, where if Death Trap kills someone, or whether Gauge kills someone with a critical hit, note, it has to be a critical hit with Gauge, it can be just any standard melee attack with Death Trap. It could even be one of his later abilities, which I'll go on to next. Anyway, it creates an electrical storm, which basically, it does that actually, it electrocutes enemies that walk into it. Some of the other abilities I mentioned a moment ago are 1-2 Boom, where Death Trap throws up an orb and it explodes and creates shock damage to all those people that are near it when you shoot it. There's also the Stare, which in theory is a giant frickin' laser beam Death Trap fires out of his eye, but when he does that it burns enemies and there's a chance to set them alight. But with both abilities, again, when it kills someone, then there's a chance to electrocute everybody else, thanks to the Shockstorm ability. There's also a few abilities within the skill tree that basically take advantage of those enemies that are already electrocuted, or basically gear up for the next one that's going to be taken down by shock damage. So for instance, there's Electrical Burn, where electrocuted enemies may burst into flame and take burn damage, so that sort of chain reacts from electrocuted enemies. And also there's Wires Don't Talk, that increases shock and electrocution damage. Last but not least, there's also Evil Enchantress, where if you kill an enemy, it increases the burn, electrocution and corrode damage you can inflict for a short time. Now this skill set really comes into its own a little bit later on in the game when you come across a lot of shielded enemies, because of the fact electric damage depletes shields so quickly. Word of warning though, when I was going through this skill set, there's one ability that tends to backfire a lot, and that is Shock and Ah! And basically what that means is when you reload your gun, you create a mini shockwave. Now I know what you're thinking, oh yeah, it sounds pretty awesome, enemies all around me, I can just reload my gun, everyone moves away. Yeah, you try telling that to 30 different explosive barrels, which happen to be within the proximity of me reloading. Yeah, it gets real old real fast when you're getting Donkey Konged by barrels simply because you want to reload your gun. So just watch where you're reloading if you're starting to use that skill. The final skill tree on the right offers one of the more challenging experiences in my opinion when using the Mechromancer. Now the Ordered Chaos skill set basically revolves around stacking Anarchy. Now Anarchy is a stackable bonus which is earned from killing enemies or emptying an entire magazine of your gun. Note here, you have to empty an entire magazine without reloading, and also Death Trap kills do not count towards Anarchy, okay? It has to be from your melee kills or your weapon kills. Now for every 1 Anarchy you earn, your gun damage goes up by 1.75% and your accuracy goes down by 1.75%. Now if you prematurely reload, stop laughing at the back, I can hear you, before you empty an entire magazine, what happens is you lose all your stacks of Anarchy, unless you've got the Discord ability, which I'll go on to a little bit later on. The initial cap is 150 Anarchy stacks, which you can get from first activating the ability itself, but you can increase that by using the pre-shrunk Cyberpunk ability, which at level 5 gives you an extra 250 stacks. There are ways of earning additional stacks, for instance there's Typecast Iconoclast, and if you have a stack of Anarchy there's a chance you can gain an additional stack, and also there's Rational Anarchist, so if you have no stacks at all, next time instead of getting 1 stack, you'd get 25. Now after going through all the technical mumbo-jumbo behind it all, we reach the $1 million question, don't we? What's the freaking point? You know, it seems like you go for all this extra effort and you're not really getting anything for it. Marginal gun increases, but again it takes away accuracy, so kind of what's the point? The point is reflected in some of the later skills you can activate, like Discord. Now remember how I said earlier if you prematurely reload you lose all the Anarchy you gain? Well, what happens if you have Discord activated is if you prematurely reload, you actually use up those stacks of Anarchy instead of losing them, and as the stacks deplete, what happens is you gain bonus accuracy, increased fire rate, and health regen. An important thing to note about Discord is you can actually disable it again by prematurely reloading. So again, you can disable it, go back to stockpiling up Anarchy, and then you can use Discord again. So it's a pretty valuable asset to have actually. So stockpile it up and it can save your life in them really close situations. Death from Above is another ability that uses up Anarchy, and what happens if you shoot an enemy in midair, it uses up those stacks of Anarchy, but it creates a digi-explosion that damages nearby enemies. With Claws is one of the final abilities you can activate, which also uses up Anarchy, and what happens is when you melee with stacks of Anarchy, they turn into Digi-Struck Claws, and what happens is you swipe at the enemy twice, it deals damage based on how many stacks of Anarchy you've got, but also it replenishes health, so the lower amount of health you've got means the more health you gain.